So the first session was a fairly granular look at what's going on inside Taiwan, but the impulse to do external policy is irresistible, and so that's what we're going to do in this session. And we're going to look at cross-strait relations, foreign relations, and US-Taiwan relations. And international space. And we have four great people to do it. I think you know them all. Alan Romberg, who's a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and director of its Asia program, will talk about cross-strait relations. June Dreyer, who's a senior fellow at FPRI and a member of, professor of political science at University of Miami, and highly respected scholar, will talk about foreign relations. Vincent Wong will talk about US-Taiwan relations. We need to congratulate Vincent because he's been at Richmond University for many years, but he will move soon to Ithaca College to become the dean of its School of Humanities and Science. Congratulations, Vincent. And then Jacques Delisle is going to do double duty and talk about international space. So without further ado, let's start with Alan.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Jacques, for organizing this, and I'm very pleased to be part of it. As Richard said, although the topic is sort of Taiwan's perspective, I'm going to try to look at the question of cross-strait relations, both where we are and the possible influences on where we'll be going from both sides of the strait to try and get some sense of a holistic picture. Going back to the previous panel, I certainly would agree that the focus of attention both in the campaign and likely going forward, will at least try to be on the part of the Tsai administration on domestic issues, especially, I would argue, the economy. But I think that it is also a truism, if nothing else, that cross-strait relations will have a pretty profound effect on the success or failure to address those issues in an effective way. Looked at from the Taiwan side, and I don't think I'm going to be telling a lot of you something you don't know, but I'd like to sort of at least give my perspective on where we are. In her inaugural address on the 20th of May, Tsai took a number of important steps to reassure Beijing that she did not have a Taiwan independence agenda, and that the main line of her approach would be to maintain continuity in substantive terms. She expanded somewhat on what she had said before regarding how the stable and peaceful development of cross-strait relations must be, as she put it, continuously promoted based on existing realities and political foundations, again, in quotation marks. She also referred, of course, to the accumulated outcomes of the more than 20 years of interactions and negotiations, that is, going back to 1992, even though she didn't mention the consensus, and that both sides needed to cherish and sustain that. So I think that what she was saying, in essence, was there's going to be no backsliding, but it's also an active process. It's not a static one. It is not something where she's just trying to hold still in terms of cross-strait relations, even though there will be some important adjustments. Another example, I think, of continuity, beside the reference to the Constitution, and I'm willing to say that some people look at the Constitution as having more than one interpretation. So I think she was trying to signal consistency with that reference. But even if people said, well, yes, but the Constitution has sometimes been defined not as a one-China Constitution. She talked about conducting her relations in accordance with the provisions of the statute governing relations between peoples in the Taiwan area and the mainland area. Jacques the lawyer here, but the explicit premise of that law is that it applies, quote, before national unification, and the mainland area is defined in the law as the territory of the Republic of China outside the Taiwan area. Now, I think it would be a distortion to suggest that by citing this, Tsai Ing-wen was committing to unification. I don't think that's a fair understanding. But it does stand, in my view anyway, and I'd like to hear other views, as a clear statement that she accepts as a practical approach the basis which has existed, which has been a one China basis under Ma, even if she won't endorse the formulation, the mantra, if you will, that Beijing has insisted upon. Another example, I think, of her effort to reassure Beijing was her statement about the responsibility to safeguard sovereignty and territory of the Republic of China. And it was in this context that she said she looked to setting aside disputes in the South and East China Sea. This, importantly, I believe, echoes the stance not only of her predecessor, Ma Ying-jeou, but also the mainland in many ways. The importance is that it is well known that Beijing is very concerned that President Tsai might abruptly change policy in particularly the South China Sea, abandoning the longstanding policy of her government, or what is now her government, in these areas as a step in a direction of separate status. I think that while it's evident that the Tsai administration is not going to collaborate with the mainland on these issues, her references are a clear statement that she's well aware of the sensitivity that I'm talking about, and that she has no intention to provoke Beijing over these matters by shifting course. Consultation with the mainland, something that Beijing calls for all the time, is not only off the table, it's clearly on the table. This includes, for example, discussion of, quote, common participation by Taiwan and the mainland in regional economic development. Now, the devil is in the details. I think Jacques used that in a different context, but I think it is true here. But at least at that broad level, in looking at regional economic activity, it's very much along the lines that Beijing has also proposed. She's emphasized that her new southbound policy, which is to promote diversification and avoid overdependence on the mainland market, is going to be a major initiative. Nonetheless, she's not abandoning the mainland market. Moreover, I think that it's pretty clear that that by seeking a cooperative relationship with Beijing on regional development, she's adopting a sensible approach that will potentially yield positive results in the long run. It's also consistent with her call for establishing a mechanism to promote trust, which is obviously sorely lacking, and to resolve disputes. From the mainland side, Beijing has repeatedly said, well, it's Tsai Ing-wen who is destroying the status quo or threatening the status quo by failing to endorse the 92 consensus, or at least some form of one China. I actually do think that the PRC realizes the dimension of political shift in Taiwan after the November 2014 local elections. They may not like it, and they may have, as was said in the last panel, shown their preference for a different outcome, but I think that they understood the likelihood of what finally did happen. But I find it hard to believe that anybody thought that Tsai Ing-wen was going to endorse one China or oppose Taiwan independence. A central factor in her whole approach has been to preserve for the people of Taiwan, ultimately, whenever that ultimate day may come, the decision power on what their relationship with the mainland should be. I don't think she has basically framed this as a statement of independence, but rather as a democratic principle. Now, mainland friends will sometimes say, well, but what do you think's in her heart? And my response is, I don't care what's in her heart. I think she has approached her likely responsibility, which she has now assumed, in an increasingly responsible manner over the last year and more. And although she talked about some things in the past that she's no longer talking about, I have no idea what, if she could shape the world in any way she wanted, she would choose. But I think she, as the leader of Taiwan, is looking to maintain, as she said, the status quo of peace and stability, and not to create cross-strait problems. Official statements by Beijing since Tsai's inauguration have given her some credit for taking steps forward from previous positions. Not only did the initial mainland statement on the 20th, rather demeaningly, in my view, give her an incomplete test grade, but it insisted that failure to directly endorse the fact that Taiwan and the mainland both belong to one and the same China would have negative consequences. So it didn't attack what she said, yeah, not bad so far, but it made clear where they wanted her to go. And beyond that, the Taiwan Affairs Office spokesman, about a week later, a little less than a week later, talked about the issue of principle regarding the nature of cross-strait relations, that is, the nature of the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland, being a mandatory question that must be answered and could not be evaded. So the mainland hasn't changed its fundamental position, but it is perhaps waiting to see how this will happen, or what will happen. And I was encouraged, frankly, by the statement by the TAO spokesperson, and by what I hear other senior officials are saying, that if she can't say the words, she at least needs to give a clear answer with concrete action. And this is something that I think President Tsai has indicated she wants the mainland to judge her on, her actions, not some formula that she really can't go along with. Now, the mainland's concern, of course, goes beyond declaring independence. It also goes to what they're calling cultural independence or a desynthesization and things like that. So this is not a once and for all kind of declaration that would solve the issue. It's going to be a process. And I think clearly it's going to take some time before we know whether cross-strait relations will continue more or less along the same lines of the last few years, or whether they will be seriously disrupted. We do know that already communication between the two so-called white glove organizations, CEF and ARITS, have been disrupted, at least in terms of ARITS not responding to faxes coming in from Taiwan. On the other hand, Beijing did go along with the participation of a Taiwan observer at the World Health Assembly this year. And despite the warning shot it issued in terms of establishing relations with the Gambia, it hasn't broken the tacit diplomatic truce so far. I would argue that in thinking about how it is going to approach these questions in the future, Beijing's got to think not only about what signals it wants to send for the short term, but also the impact on long-term relations and how people will think about the cross-strait relationship, not just today, but over time. Now, particularly in light of that longer-term perspective, what one can hope we are witnessing is the beginning of a process that eventually will lead to reaffirmation of peace and stability, including the preservation of most, if not all, of the institutional relationships that have been developed since 2008. Another alternative, of course, is that they downgrade relations between authorities and try to maintain relations with the private sector. I think that's a difficult course for the mainland to try to follow, but that is, if you took what they've been saying as their chart for the future, that's what they will do if they are not satisfied with how President Tsai eventually handles the issue. Now, perhaps some further progress can be made in the course of implementing statements that have actually come from both sides, including in Tsai's inaugural address, about setting aside the baggage of history. We'll have to see. But while it is clear that neither side would benefit from a deterioration of relations, on the other hand, no one should take lightly Tsai Ing-wen's commitment to preserve democratic processes along with peace and stability, or the importance that the mainland attaches to maintaining some kind of one China foundation. Obviously, this isn't going to be easy, nor would I say it's a foregone conclusion that positive momentum can be maintained and slippage avoided. I guess I would characterize my own position at this point as being concerned, but not really pessimistic. What I hope both sides will do is to demonstrate the greatest flexibility and creativity they can in charting a future course. Very frankly, in my own view, not only do they owe that to themselves, but I think they also owe it to the larger international community, which has a lot at stake in the maintenance of peace and stability in the Strait. With that, I'll...
Thank you. I've been asked to talk about Taiwan's relations with other countries, and I will start with the big one, because apart from Taiwan's relations with the United States, its relationship with Japan is probably the most important. It's Taiwan's fate, either for good or bad, to be positioned between China and Japan. This causes certain inescapable problems. Relations with Japan in the Ma era were very bad. There are a couple of bright spots I'll mention, but basically what happened here is Chiang Kai-shek and Jiang Jingguo had very good relations with Japan, paradoxically. Chiang Kai-shek forswore the need for reparations, which the Japanese greatly appreciated. And Japan and Taiwan had a common interest, Japan and at that time the ROC, had a common interest in being very much anti-communist. So that was a binding force. And being a political scientist, sort of, we always look for watersheds. And in this case, what happened were events that occurred approximately about the time of Tiananmen. But 1988, you have Li Denghui succeeding the Zhang dynasty, and a very different kind of person, as Shelley has gone into some detail about. And Tiananmen, the Chinese government having to put that down. We're just on the anniversary here, which much has been made of in the newspapers, both in the world and in the United States. And the Chinese government at that point is no longer communist, and it's lost the charisma of the Mao era, and it seems to fall back on nationalism. And this nationalism is, they don't really want to take on the United States, at least at this point, and it becomes very fixated on anti-Japanese persona, and it proves very popular with a lot of the Chinese population. And so you have a situation whereas the Japanese relations used to be very strongly with the KMT, the Republic of China. As Japan-China relations deteriorate, which they do in this period, Japan becomes more interested in the green spectrum. Li Denghui obviously is still on the KMT. So it switches its allegiance from sympathy with the Republic of China and the unificationists to sympathy with the at least status quo and possibly someday independence green side of the spectrum. There is no way given the unpleasant relationships back through history of China and Japan, that Japan wants Taiwan to be part of China, since it will put Japan's territorial waters and China's territorial waters smack on top of each other. And I noticed the other day that Lee Deng-hui announced he's going to visit Ishigaki Island, and that plays into this. Ishigaki is, as you gather from the name, it's under the control of Japan, but it is really, really close to Taiwan, and he's making a statement there, as he's very good at. Okay, so now, under Ma, these good relations between Japan and Taiwan took a very bad turn. Ma comes in with a unificationist agenda. That means a tilt toward China, and inevitably means a tilt away from Japan. And he had a reputation, even before he took office, of being anti-Japanese. He said this was a slander by the opposition party. And so before he took office, he visited Japan on what was supposed to be a fence-mending trip. It turned out to be anything but. He went to Japan and he criticized the prime minister for visiting the Yasukuni Shrine. And then he also said that Japan needed to pay more attention to history, which is a code word for, apologize yet again to China. And there are actually demonstrations going on outside when Ma was making these speeches, saying he was interfering in the internal affairs of Japan and he should get out. And luckily for Ma, a typhoon came up, and it kind of reminds me of the kamikaze in Mongol, the Mongol era. And so Ma could say, oh, well, I really have to get home to Taiwan because I have this typhoon to worry about. And he exited, and the Kuomintang actually, everybody declared the trip a great success, everybody in Taiwan, in Taiwan government, even though obviously it wasn't. And I think the KMT government tried to make a few amends. They decided to provide a website in Japanese so that the Japanese could get news from Taiwan from a, quote, unbiased source, and things like that. So relations really, really were not good. At another point, there was the Japanese ambassador equivalent in Taipei gave a talk in a private capacity, and he said that Japan regarded Taiwan's status as undetermined, which is actually true. And Ma got furious. He said it was determined by the San Francisco Treaty, conveniently forgetting to mention that as a condition of normal Japan-China normalization in 1972, the Chinese required the Japanese to repudiate the San Francisco Treaty. And basically, Saito was persona non grata in the presidential office afterwards, and after a couple of months, he resigned. So that's a situation. And the Japanese response to Tsai's inauguration was very correctly formal. They looked forward to pursuing good relations with Taiwan on a people-to-people basis, non-government kind of thing. But there were already indications that things were going to change. In March, i.e. after Tsai's election, but before the inauguration, a very important Diet member, Kishi Nobuo, went to Taipei for consultations. This gentleman is no ordinary Diet member. He is he's the son, grandson, grandnephew, and younger brother of prime ministers. And the odds are good that unless he screws up badly, he may become a prime minister himself. So, this is not just a casual, Diet members visit Legislative Yuan members kind of thing. And he did meet with with various important people, including Tsai, I believe, for conversations. And then Tsai appointed 2 DPP heavyweights to top positions in Taiwan-Japan relations. Frank Xie Changting, is going to be the ambassador equivalent in Tokyo. He's a former presidential candidate himself, very fluent in Japanese, studied at Kyodai, which also happens to be Li Danghui's alma mater. And then I guess the equivalent of the job Richard had, AIT had, the equivalent in Taiwan. She appointed Zhou Yiren, who's a former vice premier, and before that he was deputy head of the National Security Council. So he's going to manage affairs with Japan from Taipei. A third thing is that a defense conversation, which was very active during the Li Danghui administration and also in the Chen Shui-bian administration, this is the Tokyo, Taipei, parentheses, Washington dialogue, was revived. It had its first meeting in Taipei at the end of April, and I had an informant who attended, and there were some pretty meaningful discussions there about, along with the usual fluff about HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, some fairly substantive conversations about what could be done about common defense. So now, this is not to say that everything's going to be wonderful, because problems do exist. Some of them, Ma's critics would aver, were stirred up by Ma himself in order to make trouble before he left. For example, Richard, I think you mentioned the Okinotori issue. This is something that Ma did not need to make a big fuss about. Fishing issues are ongoing issues in this area. Ma was able to, for reasons I don't have time to get into here, but he was able to conclude a fishing agreement with Japan in April of 2013, in which each side agreed that for uncertain fishing things, again, I don't have time to get into the details, but without prejudice to anybody's sovereign claims in the area. Now, sovereignty isn't even an issue in Okinotori. And so this would be easy. The agreement would say something like Taiwan's fishing fleet is allowed to fish in areas X, Y, and Z, and this has no bearing on whether Japan has an exclusive economic zone there or not. Lawyers like Jock make a lot of money by working out the details. I don't think anyone has asked him yet, but they should. Okay. Anyway, you really have to take a lot of problems by being the only lawyer in the group, Jacques. Anyway, so that's one problem. And another one is the comfort woman issue. Again, it's hard to believe Ma wasn't stirring the pot on this one, arranging for a showing of a film on this, a public showing of a film on this, and acceding to the demands of a women's relief group in Taiwan to open a museum. But guess what? The museum won't open until October, so it's in Tsai's administration to deal with. Another one, and this is something that Kishi Nobuo discussed in not only one visit, but two, and that is the Japanese government badly wants Taiwan to buy Japanese produce from Tohoku, which is the area that was, and 4 other prefectures, that was affected by the nuclear meltdown. Now, the Japanese government has gone to great lengths to certify the purity, the non-radioactivity of these products. Actually, when I was in Japan, you could see signs in Japanese restaurants that they have agreed to serve produce there and stuff like that. These people tend to be skittish about issues like this. The Taiwan population is already sensitized to this because of the ractopamine dispute with the United States. So again, that's a solvable problem, and I'm saying don't expect there will be no issues, but these are solvable problems. And there is evident goodwill on both sides. Now, what about other countries? Some other issues. One huge one is the issue of rendition. And you have Kenya deporting 45 Taiwan citizens who were accused of criminal activity in Kenya to China, not to Taiwan, even after Kenyan courts had declared some of them were not guilty. And that's an issue. And then after that, Malaysia extradited 32 more to China in similar cases. Last week, I read that there were a number of people in Turkey also in this bind that kind of dropped out of the news, or I didn't notice the newspaper article. So if anybody of you knows any follow-up, I'm here to be educated. So that rendition problem is going to be a big one for Taiwan's relations with those countries. Please don't send those people. We have courts here. As bad as the judicial system might be, it needs to be fixed, as Shelley said. Another issue with Tsai has is the possible loss of allies. Beijing accepted the normalization of relations with Gambia a little while back. This reduces Taiwan's formal allies to just over 20. Opinions in Taiwan differ about how important this is. Gambia actually broke relations with Taiwan, the ROC, in 2013. But the reason seems to be that the Taiwan government, the ROC government, didn't want to make a payoff that the president had requested. And he did this in a fit of pique, and Beijing was actually surprised. It hadn't been informed about that. And so now, why is Beijing changing its mind now? Because Gambia actually had a no China policy, I guess, in that, or at least no China had a policy with Gambia in that period. And so some people thought, well, this is a shot across the bow to Tsai Ing-wen. There was a tacit agreement during the Ma administration that China would not siphon off any more allies. That may be at an end. What's going to happen next? We know conversations with the Vatican have been taking place and that sort of thing. So first of all, we don't know what Beijing's motive was here. It wasn't made clear. A second one is, how important is this? I mean, you lose a couple countries like Gambia, and good, if the PRC wants to pay their governments, this is not necessarily a bad thing for Taiwan. And what Taiwan should really be doing is concentrating on building good relations, albeit on a non-government to government basis, with, you will pardon me for saying this, more powerful actors in the international system. And Taiwan has been working very hard in the last couple of months, actually toward the end of the Ma administration, on visa-free entries for reciprocal visa-free entries, which, if you have visa-free entries with countries, that's a sort of affirmation of the sovereignty of Taiwan. So things like that. And just the next issue is, yes, it's a good idea to reduce dependence on China. And how do we do that? We increase our relations with other countries. There is a new southbound, under the Tsai administration, a new southbound policy office, one part of which is to increase tourism in Southeast Asia, to compensate for China's plan to reduce Chinese tourism to Taiwan. And this is very interesting because there is a website where you can look up the number of tourists from everywhere to Taiwan. I actually wrote it down, http://admin.taiwan.net.taiwan/statistics, if you want to look it up. And although China said it was going to slash the number of tourists, the number of tourists actually went up. And I've actually got the statistics here if anyone is interested. So another thing that the Southbound Policy Office is doing is there are conversations taking place about reciprocal arrangements between Taiwan universities and universities in Southeast Asia. So, okay, next issue, and we're getting to the end here, maintaining and expanding Taiwan's presence in international organizations. This could be tough, as this World Health Assembly issue shows. It should be said that even under the Ma administration, which had argued that better relations with Beijing would bring more recognition of Taiwan internationally, Beijing was not very cooperative. Taiwan got an observer capacity attendance like Hong Kong, which is everybody agrees, even Hong Kongers who don't like it, that Hong Kong is a part of China. And Taiwan's invitation was more restrictive even than Hong Kong's, because Hong Kong doesn't have to get reinvited every year. And this year, for the first time, the invitation referred to on the basis of the One China principle. And this is seen as a further goad to Tsai to accept that 1992 consensus. And as I think Alan mentioned, the Taiwan did attend, with its representative raising hackles back home by referring to his country as Chinese Taipei and not as Taiwan, and Tsai saying that although she wasn't pleased, that was, quote, acceptable. Still, this was better than in 2010, when a WHO document described Taiwan as a province of China, and that was too much for even the Ma administration. There were no meetings between the PRC and the, quote, ROC for 2 years, at least no public ones. Now, in sum, Taiwan's international relations are problematic, with Beijing very much calling the moves, but with certain restraints. As Shelley mentioned, coming on too tough, when China comes on too tough to Taiwan, so far this has strengthened the pro-independence forces, or at least the anti-unification forces in Taiwan. It also has repercussions in Hong Kong, where there are already restive elements, the umbrella movement protests, and so on. And it also has a bad effect on countries already worried about Beijing's expansion into the South China Sea. And then another problem is the opposition party. And here I do look at the United Daily News frequently. 27th of May describes Tsai's foreign policy, and I wrote this down because I wanted to be so sure to get it correct. Describes Tsai's foreign policy as clinging to America's apron strings, cozying up to Japan, and keeping the arm's length at the mainland at arm's length. Her thinking reflects her, quote, first the world, then the mainland, unquote. And I thought, well, what's wrong with that? And reduces cross-Strait relations to regional relations. I'm cool with that one, too. Subordinating cross-Strait relations to great power diplomacy. Was it ever otherwise? An activist diplomacy of peace. I didn't think that one was so bad either. Based on humanitarian aid, medical assistance, financial assistance, and anti-terrorism. And then they conclude, she is looking at a tightrope strung across a chasm, which is a great metaphor, but not necessarily the case. Now, again, as several speakers before me have said, the KMT is in bad disarray, and it may not be able to block these policies as much as it would like. And I will have to close with another quote, this one from my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra, who said, "Prediction is always difficult, especially about the future." Thank you. Well, actually, it's out already. No, it does. It does. It's just that they shipped. Anyhow, please read my book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Brookings Institution and FPRI for inviting me. In fact, such gatherings are my preferred occasions than doing deaning stuff. So I was asked to comment on the prospect of US-Taiwan relations under the Tsai administration. I will give my bottom line first and then develop my arguments. I think overall, we will see this relationship largely positive. It will take some time to adjust. It will take more skills to manage. It also may be a higher maintenance than the previous 8 years. So this is my bottom line. So I'd like to begin with entertaining a thesis, see if there's some truth in it and whether you can agree. I would argue that the US-Taiwan relations in the last 16 years, or maybe last 20 years, have been maintained by the basic policy framework, which you can consult the State Department website. But the impetuses for the calibration of this basic framework, I'm talking about the 3 communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act and so on, have come mainly and initially actually from Taiwan. So if you can see the US-Taiwan-China relations as a triangle, and then of course some people in this room are familiar with the literature on the so-called strategic triangle and all these different scenarios like a romantic triangle or ménage à trois and so on. But if you think about the relationship as a triangular relationship, or you can think about it as a sequential relationship, in other words, in this triangle, these 3 actors, who makes the first move, who makes the second move, and who makes the third move? My thesis is that if we look back to the Chen administration and the Ma administration, of course now the Tsai administration, it's actually Taiwan that makes the first move. And then China makes the second move. And the United States makes the third move. And let me explain. And of course, this is, of course, is a abstract on the realities. Realities, of course, are much more complex than this. Take the Chen Shui-bian administration, for example, from 2000 to 2008. I would describe his Taiwan domestic policy, which is the first move, is primarily a Taiwan discourse. Essentially, as University of Southern California scholar Daniel Lynch described, that in Chen's administration, there had been a very aggressive nation-building project. And this can be seen in many aspects, such as the revision of the textbooks, the change of the names of state-owned enterprises from, for example, China shipbuilding to Taiwan shipbuilding and so on. Or people have called that a sort of a salami tactic in de-Sinicization. Of course, when Chen Shui-bian was inaugurated in May 2000, there had been initial hope that for the first time, the DPP controlled the executive branch and may clean up some of the corruption of KMT, which had ruled Taiwan for 55 years. And a lot of people placed very high hope. And of course, people were less familiar with his cross-strait policy. And in fact, as Richard set out at the beginning, that the DPP probably themselves was surprised. So a lot of people, probably some people in this room as well, worked very hard to ensure that he said those words of reassurance, which are known as the 四不一没有, or the 4 no's and one not. Basically, it was a conditional reassurance. But after the initial 2 years of goodwill, or sort of olive branch extended to China, which was not reciprocated, and China from the very beginning was very distrustful of Chen, and the relationship went south starting 2002, and then we have a period of tension-ridden cross-strait relations. It became so bad that the Chen administration was seen as the troublemaker, or the one that wanted to change the status quo. And of course, a culmination was former President George W. Bush's remarks in front of the visiting Chinese premier, Wen Jiabao. So the US and China basically, quote unquote, co-managed Taiwan. And US-Taiwan relations during this period was very difficult. Chen, and if you can use so-called transit diplomacy as an indicator, Chen initially was given the transit through New York City, which of course was very high profile, very important and all that. And in the end, he was barred even from Honolulu, so he decided to chart his own course, so to speak. And then of course, it manifested in the international organizations. The Chen administration also took a sort of a more direct and confrontational approach. For example, applying for the United Nations General Assembly as a new member under the name Taiwan, or forced a vote in the World Health Organization, which Taiwan lost badly. So when Ma Ying-jeou came to power, the U.S. sighed a sign of relief because, of course, Ma Ying-jeou, I would argue that his domestic politics was a ROC discourse, or at least an ROC in Taiwan discourse. He did not restore the national unification guidelines, but nonetheless, he could rationalize his domestic discourse that the ROC was this part of one China, except that this ROC in Taipei was the real China. So for example, he developed a lot of attention to the 70th anniversary of the Sino-Japanese War, which the DPP probably did not care very much anyway. And then he, in his inaugural speech, he talked about the 3 no's. He guaranteed that in his term, there will be no unification, no independence, therefore there will be no use of war. And he basically spent a lot of time restoring the mutual trust with the United States. And for the cross-strait relations, he quickly accepted the 1992 consensus as a basis, political basis for resuming the political dialogue with the mainland. Although here, I must say that the so-called 1992 consensus, which was very much in the center of this, all this, a lot of attention, whether Tsai actually made that utterance or close to it during her inaugural speech, was actually a term coined by Suu Kyi in 2000, post facto, to refer to the political understanding reached by the 2 semi-official bodies in 1992. At that time, the 2 sides of Taiwan Strait only dealt with the so-called pragmatic matters. Of course, the distinction between pragmatic matters and political matters may be blurred, but when the KMT returned to power, they just say that 1992 consensus was the basis of political. And of course, cross-strait relations it advanced very quickly, and that was under the 1992 consensus. They have no problem with that. So the United States' concern at this time was no longer that Taiwan would be so provocative that it triggered a war in the Taiwan Strait, that the United States would be dragged in to fight a war that it did not want to. And during the Ma administration, there was actually a contrary concern. And this concern was actually first raised by the excellent scholar Nancy Tucker in 1992, the National Interest article. That in the past, we have all worried about China using force against Taiwan, but now what if the Taiwan willingly join China? Should we care about that? And I think that article was the first one to raise this question. And then there was certainly some people who felt that in the Ma administration, the United States play a much more secondary role, and its role was less clear than before. The Ma administration also took a less confrontational approach when it comes to international participation. Rather than knocking at the door of the UN General Assembly, it called on the United Nations specialized agencies and the call for, rather than seeking membership, it sought so-called meaningful participation. He had been criticized by his detractors as pursuing a China-first strategy. Now, and of course, in the Ma administration, the basic strategy could be summarized as 亲美和中有日, or pro-US, maintaining peace with China, and friendly toward Japan. If you understand the sequence of those three sets of important relationships to Taiwan, then you can understand the priorities his administration placed in that. And June already gave a very excellent presentation on the perceived change of the Tsai administration, whether that the relative importance of those three sets of relationship would change under the Tsai administration. Now to Tsai administration, it's only 2 weeks old, or maybe a little bit over 2 weeks old. And the initial signs suggest, these of course are very preliminary, that in terms of her domestic politics, there are competing impulses within Taiwan, particularly from her own party, that want to maybe refashion a Taiwan-first discourse. However, as one of the speakers already mentioned, that Tsai is very smart. She's also very skilled at managing these differences. So I don't expect that the domestic politics in Taiwan under the Tsai administration would have the same kind of provocative external implications as the Chen administration. However, because Tsai had not completed the unanswered question sheet, as Alan mentioned, that the Beijing has decided to maintain a cold peace with Taiwan. And what does that mean? Well, obviously, Tsai is going to focus on domestic politics. She's probably never going to fully satisfy Beijing. And then this is also at the same time that Beijing has become more powerful and more insistent on her political demands on Taiwan. So this leads to my discussion about the US-Taiwan relations under the Tsai administration. I think that unlike the Ma administration, the Tsai administration will actually need the United States more and is more likely to make more demands. And this might present some challenges of maintaining this relationship. If the US-Taiwan relations were indeed, as they said, the best in 60 years, due to the low maintenance, low expectation, and so on, I think the expectations will be higher, at least from the Taiwan side. I don't know about from the US side. And is it possible that Tsai will actually move closer to the US and Japan than to China? So 亲美和中有日. Is it possible that Tsai will actually 亲美, 亲日, and put 有中 at the very distant 3? So the question for the thesis, I really set out at the beginning. I argue that in the last 20 years, it was Taiwan that made the first move, China makes the second move, and the United States make the third move. And I argue that the US policy framework basically still work, but it has been very skillful in calibrating to restore a status quo that is favorable to the United States. But looking into the future, should the United States become the first mover? Should the United States actually make the first move? If that is the case, what will be the conditions under which the US would do that? That would involve a reassessment of Taiwan's role in and the contributions in US broader strategy. that will also involve a reassessment of US-China relations. For example, Taiwan's role in the Pacific pivot. I had another article talking about why the US was studiously silent about Taiwan's role in the Pacific pivot. So let me just offer a few priorities or outstanding issues for US-Taiwan in the Tsai administration. I think the first thing to do when new players come to town is actually to understand each other. What I mean by that is that the two sides need to engage in an immediate and high-level strategic dialogue. This dialogue can be conducted quietly, but nonetheless has to be substantive, not just for show. The purpose of this dialogue is to clarify each other's true intentions and give each other strategic reassurances. The purpose of this is actually to alleviate the classic dilemma in alliance management. For the smaller party, they are afraid to be abandoned by the more powerful state. For the powerful state, they are more afraid to be entangled by a war caused by the lesser state. So people know that President Tsai is going to transit through the United States very soon, probably in a couple of weeks, to Panama and Paraguay. And I'm sure that there will be opportunities on that trip or before or after that trip for the security teams of the United States and Taiwan to clarify each other's intentions and to set out the list of requests from each other. And then it's very important for the subsequent policies to follow from these the renegotiated pact between new administration. Although I said new administration, which is only partially true because on the US side, we have an outgoing administration for another 7 months. So maybe this needs to be renegotiated in January 2017, should there be a new president from a different political party. Another important thing high on the agenda or pressing is actually to cope with Taiwan's defensive needs. Of course, the TRA is very clear about this, but we also know that Taiwan arms sales to Taiwan have never been truly free from political or diplomatic considerations. So is it possible for the United States and Taiwan to both depoliticize this arms sale or defense procurement issue? The Taiwanese politicians should take responsibility because both the KMT and the DPP had used arms sales issues for political gains when they were opposition parties. But of course, now the DPP is the ruling party. It obviously look around the world and see that only the United States is willing to sell defensive arms to Taiwan. And for the United States, I was encouraged by the recent congressional resolution reaffirming the 6 assurances, which includes that the U.S. will not consult China prior to arms sales and so on. And the Department of Defense reports repeatedly said the military balance has shifted toward China and so on. And at the same time, that our American friends have also noticed that Taiwan has been spending barely over 2% of its GDP on defense spending. So the two sides obviously have a lot to do. Taiwan needs to show its more resolve of defending itself, and the United States should be more attentive to Taiwan's increasing legitimate defensive needs. Some items are long overdue. I don't know if anyone still remember. In 2001, former President George W. Bush promised to assist Taiwan with diesel submarines. Is anybody still remember this? And then I noticed that President Tsai, in her inaugural speech, talked about 5 new industries to inject the new vitality to Taiwan's difficult economic transitions. One of them was actually domestic defense industry. And there have been talk about Taiwan wants, because they could no longer wait for the United States to either sell or facilitate the sale of diesel submarines, so they might do it themselves. And we know that Taiwan cannot do it themselves without some assistance from the United States, either from getting the blueprint, the design, or facilitating technical assistance. I think so. This is one example that the United States can do and should do that 2001 to 2016, so that's this 15-year overdue. Another thing that might be high on the agenda is to the U.S. can assist Taiwan's greater economic role in regional integration, and particularly the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is one of the few issues that both the blue and the green have an agreement on. And they both want to, and they already made a case. And I think the cases they made were pretty similar. Why TPP is important to Taiwan and why Taiwan should be in there. And the United States so far has said, we have noticed that Taiwan has raised its hand, and we welcome this interest, but it has to wait until the second round. And of course, TPP now is sitting in Congress. In a presidential election year, the outcome is uncertain. But I think the United States can be just a little bit more encouraging because helping Taiwan enter TPP is not just because it's good for Taiwan, it's also good for the United States. If Taiwan were a member in the TPP, it would instantaneously become the 6th largest economy of the membership, and Taiwan is the 9th largest trading partner of the United States, and there's also consideration about the global value chain and so on. So I think it's mutually beneficial for the United States to facilitate Taiwan in TPP, and which in turn will leverage Taiwan's headways in RCEP. Of course, there's this outstanding issue about the pork containing reclamate mine, and I think that the early signs show that the Tsai administration, because now it's in power, even though the DPP politicians used to obstruct this, as I said, Taiwan politicians have used arms sales or trade issues for political gains. DPP politicians have done that, but now they're in power. It is their responsibility to overcome the political logjam. I think I'm confident that this could be resolved. International participation, my colleagues have said a lot, so I won't say very much, except to say that the United States should be a little bit more proactive in presenting Taiwan's international persona. And I think sometimes our U.S. policy has actually unintentionally limited the potential positive roles Taiwan can play on the international stage. For example, our official policy when it comes to Taiwan's participating in international organizations is that we do not support Taiwan in organizations requiring statehood. In those that do, we encourage Taiwan's meaningful participation. Well, unfortunately, many of the most important international organizations involved in setting global rules and for globalization and so on are actually intergovernmental organizations. So our policy have actually unintentionally or predictably limited Taiwan's role in international organizations. And I have another paper talking about maybe perhaps some creative way of reframing a state sovereignty to a functional competency. I think the U.S. could do more. And also along this line, the U.S. and Taiwan can think about many areas they can cooperate. I was glad to see that U.S.-Taiwan relations improved from Chen Shui-bian era to Ma Ying-jeou era, and they are beginning to talk about so-called positive agenda. I think in terms of values, there's no question that the Tsai administration shared the same values as the U.S. administration. One example of this was the so-called vessel called the Global Cooperation Training Framework. This is a framework that the State Department, U.S. State Department and its Taiwanese counterpart talk about concrete areas where Taiwan can actually contribute to regional cooperation or global cooperation. I will end with a cautionary note. Even though the relationship fundamentally are sound, it requires some calibration, adjustment, getting to know one another. The next 7 months we are actually advised to be cautious. The reason is we have an outgoing Obama administration. There is a tendency that I'm in transition, so I know too well that so there's a tendency not to do too much when you are on the way out, right? But this is also the time whether the Chinese leaders feel they can actually test the outgoing Obama administration. We can see some signs, ranging from the South China Sea issue and so on. Especially if the Chinese become so impatient or they cannot stand that the Tsai continue to refuse to answer the answer sheet, whether they feel that this is a good time to actually test the new Taiwanese leader and the outgoing American leader. The last point is, by now it's clear it will be Clinton against Trump. So as I mentioned before, that maybe U.S.-Taiwan relations need to be renegotiated in 7 months, while conventional wisdom may say that what U.S.-Taiwan relations might look like is more easily predicted under a Clinton administration. I'm not so sure about U.S.-Taiwan relations under a Trump administration. In fact, it actually aroused a lot of curiosity that it's hard to imagine what kind of role Taiwan will play under a Trump administration. Thank you.
Jacques?
Yes, uncertainty. Well, thank you. I will try to keep my remarks fairly brief so we have some chance for Q&A. I'm addressing the question of Taiwan's international space, broadly defined, and international organizations as one piece of that. And as has been true with several of my colleagues here, I think we think of the past as prologue. So what Tsai inherits, what Tsai's prospects are in this area, what the Taiwan under Tsai face in this area is partly the product of what's been inherited from the Ma years and before. So I'll say a little bit about the Ma legacy on each of these fronts, formal international organizations, diplomatic relations, bilateral relations with a somewhat state-to-state-like quality, and then a couple of other features as well. So if we look at the Ma legacy here, I mean, one of the principal tropes of the Ma years in this area was international space, right? Guoji Kongjian was the real phrase of the time, and there are some real accomplishments here. The biggest one in terms of formal international organizations, of course, was the repeated attendance at the WHA with observer status. And really the ability to avoid slippage or erosion of many of the other international organizations that Taiwan was able to participate in, APEC, things like that. Taiwan also in the last moments of the Ma years got some mileage out of the South China Sea arbitration between the Philippines and China as a non-participant, in that at the very late stages of this, the Chinese Taiwan Society of International Law amicus brief got in and got taken seriously. I may have even delayed the decision because of the perception accurately that Taiwan, although excluded from UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, and excluded from the arbitration proceedings, nonetheless, because of Taiping Island, had a significant stake in some of the issues before the tribunal. And throughout the Ma years, Taiwan continued, with some revisions, a long-standing strategy of what can be called as-if participation. Taiwan acts as if it is a member of major international conventions, major international legal and institutional norms, as a way of sort of demonstrating shared values, but also demonstrating the capacity and the intent to behave the way it would behave if it were fully accepted as a member of these organizations and conventions. Diplomatically, of course, the other signature feature of the Ma years in this area was the diplomatic truce, the idea that the mainland, that Beijing would not poach diplomatic allies, and that largely, pretty much entirely held true with the partial exception of Gambia near the end. And in terms of bilateral relations that gave Taiwan an enhanced state or state-like status in the international system, we saw a fair amount under Ma. The fisheries agreement with Japan, the negotiations with the Philippines after the killing of a Taiwanese fisherman. These kinds of things put Taiwan in the position of negotiating on a peer level with other governments in the region. And Ma also took advantage of the South China Sea and East China Sea controversies to articulate positions that put Taiwan at the table, the East China Sea Peace Initiative, the South China Sea Peace Initiative, which not only sort of elbowed Taiwan's way, as it were, into this multilateral dispute among states, but also was welcomed in some quarters because it created some daylight between the ROC position and the PRC position, which of course was welcomed by all those many claimants and non-claimants like the US who were not entirely pleased with the PRC position on these issues. And of course ECFA and the various follow-on agreements that raised Taiwan's status to some degree of equality with the mainland. And of course, on the U.S. side, as Vincent's talked about, a lot of repairing of relations with the U.S. and reaffirmation of that relationship, which had frayed badly under Chen Shui-bian. No change in formal status, of course, but a rehabilitation of the functional relationship. And of course, there was the soft power element under Ma as under Chen, and as we can expect going forward, an emphasis on Taiwan's status as a democracy, a human rights regarding polity, and a contributor to various international regimes and behaviors and practices, being a good citizen. But there were limits under Ma as well, of course, in international organizations. There was no progress beyond the WHA in terms of the core UN-linked systems. Taiwan did remain largely frozen out of the Permanent Court of Arbitration process. The irony of China, which was the named party in this case, not showing up and yet having its views heard, and Taiwan trying to show up, not being allowed to participate, and only at the last minute getting some of its views heard. The frustration over TPP, the inability to get in round one, and the uncertainty still of round two. The lack of progress in terms of Taiwan's engagement with the proliferation of PRC-centered institutions and organizations in the region, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and so on. And in terms of diplomacy, of course, at the end, Gambia, which had been, as June said, a no-China state, wound up going over to the PRC side, and of course the repatriation or the extradition, the rendition of accused Taiwanese criminals to the PRC rather than to Taiwan. Bilaterally, of course, the Ma era was marked by somewhat rocky relations, as June has told you, with Japan, and growing concern in Taiwan about whether cross-strait relations were proving to be as appealing as they had initially been framed, and certainly the blowback we saw in the Sunflower Movement, the 2014 elections, and ultimately the 2016 elections, all of which reflected concerns with overdependence on China and concerns that the promise of improvement and sort of greater equality and engagement in cross-strait relations would have the promised benefits. In terms of relations with the U.S., TIFA remains ever over the horizon, TPP behind it, ractopamine infects everything apparently, and Ma took it on the chin from the U.S. over his visit to Taiping Island. So there were certainly sources of friction near the end there. And more broadly, the sense that what progress had been made on all these fronts, international organizations, bilateral relations, and more diffuse participation, all of this had come, in the view of Ma's critics, and the DPP included, in Taiwan at a rather high price in terms of accepting things like the 92 consensus, 3 no's, and so on. And of course, toward the end of the Ma administration, actually not even just toward the end, but for a lot of the Ma administration, the looming question of how hard and how fast the mainland would start to push for more progress and push into an area where the possible erosion of Taiwan's status and autonomy would be at stake. So that's the background. What does this mean for Tsai? Well, she inherits all of that. Including on some of the broader points I've touched on, a much more positive view from the United States than had been the case in 2008 when Ma came to power, and the kind of ambivalence and wariness from China that we were also familiar with from the Chen years. So she's got that mixed inheritance from the Ma era. If we look at her agenda going forward, I think it's fairly clear it's to preserve and to, where possible, expand on Taiwan's participation and stature in the international system while preserving the cross-strait status quo and preserving the improved relations with the U.S. that were achieved under Ma. On the international organizations front, we have some early, very mixed evidence. June's touched upon the WHA visit. In some sense, this was kind of neutral with this latest round. Once again, Taiwan was allowed to attend in a sort of secondary status, an observer, of more meaningful participation without anything like full access, a contingent status that was ad hoc, dependent on a new invitation each year, and of course, under the unacceptable but accepted rubric name of Chinese Taipei, and so on. So all of that was very much like 2009 and thereafter. On the more negative side, the invitation came late. There was a new reference in the invitation letter to UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 and WHA Resolution 25.1, the resolutions that expelled the ROC and gave the Chinese seat to the PRC, a reference to the One China principle as the foundation of Taiwan's participation here. That's all negative. It prompted a letter of protest from the Taiwan Minister of Health and Welfare, who attended the meeting. And after much intra-departmental discussion reportedly in Taiwan, the decision was made not to say Taiwan in the speech this time, but refer to Chinese Taipei, even though Taiwan had been mentioned in 2013. There's also the risk that the relatively positive element of getting the invitation was, of course, in some sense, an 11th hour Ma invitation, not a first hour Tsai invitation. It came before Tsai took power, and it came to the previous Minister of Health as well. It should have, given who was in power at the time. And of course, Beijing has the opportunity to reassess and decide what to do for next year's WHA meeting. On the plus side with the WHA gathering, however, there are some positive signs for Taiwan's international organization participation. There was a quick handshake in the hallway with the PRC counterpart for Taiwan's health minister. There was a particular little frisson in that the Indian Minister of Health did not show up to chair the meeting, so the principal vice chair, the Chinese representative, had to open the meeting where Taiwan was participating. There, at the time of Tsai's ascension to power, both before and after the WHO meeting itself, repeated statements that Taiwan managed to, in a sense, get away with without much blowback from the mainland, before saying that politics and the one China principle had nothing to do with Taiwan's participation in the WHO. And of course, these positive developments look more positive because they must be measured against the baseline risk that China could have said no and could have prevented the attendance this time. Going forward, Tsai has identified agendas in formal international organizations that are a familiar list. The top two that she's mentioned are Interpol and ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. Those have long been up there. They fit with a venerable Taiwan strategy of trying to join those organizations that are either state member only or close to state members, where Taiwan can say it is an important actor in the international system such that excluding Taiwan makes the regime incomplete. That's clearly true with civil aviation. It's true especially with these renditions in the criminal area. And they can also be portrayed as relatively non-political organizations. They're functional international cooperation, functioning safety type organizations where the case can be made fairly strongly. And that's, of course, been the argument for WHA as well, as you'll remember that has its origins in the SARS crisis. That said, there are limits. There's no sign that Beijing is going to drop its barriers to expanded participation. It's very easy to drag one's feet on these. Every UN-affiliated organization has its own charter, its own rules, which makes each one sui generis and therefore easy to resist. And it doesn't seem to be at the top of Tsai's list to get into a lot of these international organizations. She has other fish to fry. There will be some more opportunities, perhaps, to weigh in the Law of the Sea Permanent Court of Arbitration decision, depending on what's decided. If there is a decision that touches on the status of Taiping Island, then I think you will see a lot of attention paid to that. Tsai has put the TPP very much at the top of her list. This makes sense given her economic agenda and given that she's a good old WTO negotiator, and this is her specialty, international trade law, back in the day. Still, the prospects here are limited. I think the TPP is sharing a small closet on Capitol Hill with Merrick Garland right now. So it may be a while before we see much action on that. And I think what we will see, and Taiwan has pretty much given up on the AIIB at least in the near term. So I think what we will see is the as-if strategy will continue. Taiwan will, where possible under Tsai, continue to behave as a responsible international citizen, to act the way it would if it were fully in these regimes. We see one early sign of this in that Taiwan has just completed its second quadrennial review of compliance with the principal international human rights covenants, which Taiwan has not been allowed to join, but it does the same kind of process you would if you were doing UPR. And so 2016 was the second round, and that's going to get a fair amount of attention. On the diplomatic side, of course, we have the Gambia issue, but we also have the upcoming visit to Panama and Paraguay, working alphabetically, with a transit stop in the United States. And Panama is an unusually significant one because it is celebrating the expansion of the canal, so a lot of heads of states are going to be there, including that Xi Jinping fellow. So in a sense, that gives us an added stature to this visit, more than is true of a typical Taiwanese presidential visit to another country with which Taiwan maintains diplomatic relations. Bilaterally, I won't repeat what's been said here except to flag the emphasis that Tsai is putting on more robust bilateral relations with a number of countries in the region. Japan, of course, the Go South policy and ASEAN, and so on. And U.S. relations are looking pretty positive. Certainly a contrast to what they looked like when Tsai was a candidate in 2012 and what that would have looked like. Congress has been making somewhat louder than average noises on things like the 6 assurances and defense cooperation and so on. That often doesn't really amount to much, but it creates a little bit of political pressure calling for RIMPAC and other such things. More significantly, the administration, although as Vincent says, silent for a long time on the pivot, we've had statements from Russell and from Ash Carter and others that bring Taiwan more into the security architecture that the U.S. Emphasizes in the Western Pacific. Cross-Straits remains to be seen, certainly a temporary chill. No, I think, definitive signs yet that we're going to see an unraveling of the accomplishments made in ECFA and what followed. And as under Ma, a lot of Taiwan's quest for international space and stature turns really on soft power things. Thriving democracy, human rights protection, that sort of thing. And we'll see those values continue to get a lot of attention. That said, I would close with one slightly pessimistic note in that the real test for Taiwan's democracy now, I think, has shifted. And if you look at the Asian barometer surveys and things like that, it's not all sunshine and puppies. There is a concern that Taiwanese democratic institutions and processes have to deliver. There's a real sort of performance test. Can it deal with these difficult challenges? And if not, then the bloom may be off the rose there, as it is in many democracies throughout Asia and beyond. And of course, finally, only a limited amount of this is under Tsai's and Taiwan's control. Much depends on how Beijing reacts and how the U.S. and others react to Beijing's reaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques. I'm going to go a little beyond our set time, so we have a little bit more time for questions. And I would ask you to keep your questions brief. As you can tell, my colleagues up here are very smart. You don't need to state a paragraph to get your question across. You can just use a sentence. But please identify yourself once you have the mic and a short question. So who would like to ask the first question? Okay, we'll go here and then over there, please.
Iris Shaw of DPP U.S. Mission. Mr. Romberg, you mentioned that the President Tsai said in her inaugural address about the East and South China Sea, partly echoing President Ma's words and signaling some goodwill to the PRC. While the words might have resonance, the deeds that would potentially escalating the regional tension is unlikely to be followed. We won't see a big publicity campaign on the Taiping Island. Neither will MOFA issue statements that's seen as in line with the PRC. More importantly, the presidential office have reiterated Taiwan's claim will adhere to the international law and UNCLOS. So I would like to ask for more of your insight of how Taiwan going forward will trade this troubled water. Thank you.
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that two basic pillars, if you will, to the DPP or President Tsai's policy. One is international law, which she has stressed, as, by the way, did President Ma, both being lawyers. And the other is not to cause a big problem, including specifically in cross-strait relations. So my sense is that she has stated very clearly a position on Taiping Dao, and I don't think there will be any change in that. When challenged on the issue of claims to other pieces of turf in the South China Sea, she basically has said, we're not going to change our position without defining necessarily what that position is. But clearly, she's not going to move away from that. So I think that she's going to try and adhere to principle, but not get in trouble with Beijing. And balancing those two things, I think, will be sort of at the center of how she looks at these issues. And as I say, I think where she put that sort of half sentence on the South China Sea and East China Sea in her speech, which was about preserving sovereignty and so on, was an important indicator of particularly the latter piece of this. But no question she will maintain a principal position on adherence to international law.
Thank you. Lady right over there. Where's it? No, I'm sorry. Further up. She looks like a lady.
Hi, I'm Dahlia Peterson. I'm with the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission.
Hold the mic closer to your mouth, please.
Dahlia Peterson, US-China Economic Security Review Commission. Beyond the trade relations with looking at US, Japan, and the PRC, are there any particular other nations that we should look at specifically, or any world regions that we should look at that Taiwan would be, that Tsai Ing-wen would be looking to broaden economic diversification agenda? And if so, are there any particular sectors that we should be looking at, such as clean energy or biotechnology, or et cetera?
Anybody want to take that on?
Well, it seems to me that the area that Taiwan has been devoting most of its energy to is Southeast Asia. And they have been, actually, there was a list that you can get hold of industries that she was planning to work on. And one of them was biotechnology. I remember that. And the other was clean energy and things like that. So you can get those. By the way, Japan has been very badly neglected in the USCC's reports. I'm a former commissioner.
Yes, I understand.
And I think you guys really ought to consider that for next year.
Just to add one word that June said, another country or region that the Tsai administration placed high hope is actually India. It's actually part of her southbound policy. And this is another nation of 1 billion people. And just in many ways, its economy and Taiwan's economy are complementary to each other. This is also the other country that has actually refused the Free Confucius Institute because of its suspicion about China. So the upside is potential, and the DPP thinkers know this. But of course, we know that economics can be driven by politics, but economics also have its own dynamics, right? Another word about, June mentioned the new industries. She talked about the green energy and so on. This should be seen in tandem with the DPP's declared policy of making Taiwan nuclear free by 2025. In fact, even now there's an acute power shortage. The new economics minister said that this goal will remain unchanged. So nuclear power currently make up 20% of Taiwan's power generation. So this new energy or green energy is supposed to fill that void left behind by nuclear energy.
Yeah, the gentleman towards the back over here.
Thank you. My name is Song, and I'm a journalist from Shanghai. And as you have discussed, Beijing will continue to pressure Tsai Ing-wen to accept 92 consensus. And we just came to know, according to some media coverage, that she may propose Mr. Song Zu-yu, head of Qingmingdang, to be to lead this Hai Ji Hui to try to comfort this Beijing side. And in the future, this Hai Ji Hui and Lu Wei Hui from their levels will try to accept 92 consensus, but from Tsai, she will not mention this 92 consensus. Do you think this kind of way will work? My question is basically for Mr. Allen and for other panelists also. Thank you very much.
Yeah. First of all, that's a press report, and we discussed this in the earlier session. We don't know, and frankly, I think I heard Richard say, if I did, I agree with it, that the main thing that's going to matter to Beijing is at a leadership level, not at the CEF level or whatever. So there may be efforts in a variety of ways, not just the one you're citing as a possibility, to try to sort of, in substantive terms, meet the PRC's druthers on this. But I think how President Tsai handles this is going to be really the key from Beijing's point of view. And as I said in my remarks, my hope is that, since I don't believe she's going to say what Beijing wants her to say, that as they look at the substance of her approach, they will see that in fact it is not challenging, not provoking. It is not it is not a Taiwan independence agenda. It is not a challenge one China agenda, but that remains to be seen.
Donghui Yu, and then I'll go to Joe.
Thank you, Donghui Yu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. I just read a report on a very popular Chinese website called Toutiao that the new survey in Taiwan shows that 90% of the responders support maintaining the status quo of cross-strait relations. But the interesting thing is, under this article, I saw a lot of comments from the Chinese netizens. Most of them are calling for unification or no believing in peaceful separation. So my question is how this kind of public opinion may affect the Beijing's policy toward Taiwan in the next several years, particularly under the leadership of Xi Jinping. Thank you.
Anybody?
I think part of that. I mean, so the numbers reported on, I mean, I haven't seen that particular survey, but the numbers on public opinion in Taiwan have been, in many ways, quite stable, which is, if you make the question conditional, it comes out pretty much what you'd expect. That is, if the mainland were willing to let Taiwan go tomorrow, you get a much higher number. If it's, under current circumstances, no one wants to die on the hill of formal independence so long as a degree of functional independence similar to what's in place now is maintained. So, the netizen reaction, I mean, that is a perennial question, which I'm sure everybody on this panel has opinions about. But it strikes me as there is a genuine, ardent, strident nationalist strain in public opinion in China. But the question ultimately is partly, so what? One of the problems with a system where you don't have elections is that you are hardly randomly sampling a population, and intensity of preferences actually weirdly gets more weight than in a system where you just go and pull the lever. Some of it is ginned up. There's censorship of some things. I mean, it's very hard to read, and I think one of the real conundra of trying to deal with Chinese popular nationalism is sussing out how much of it is used as a pretext when Xi or others want to go nationalist in their policy, and how much of it is a genuinely perceived, not fully democratic, but real popular constraint. And I think that's just hard to know. I think it is too facile either to say that nationalist public opinion deeply constrains the leadership so that it has no more room to maneuver than you would in a democracy or something like that. It is equally wrong to say that this can be completely dismissed or it's completely ginned up. It's somewhere in the middle, and it's very hard to assess.
I think that Xi Jinping is the person who really calls the shots on this one. And if there's that 50-cent party that will get paid for posting things.
But there's also genuine unpaid.
But what I'm saying is it's very, I would distrust these polls for the reason, as you mentioned, sussing out what is the percentage of the real nationalists here, and what is the percentage of people who are being nudged in various ways to say what they will. And I see Xi as having problems of his own. There is credible evidence of dissension in the ranks. He is ignoring Li Keqiang. He has an economic slowdown problem to worry about. He has a number of very unhappy people in Hong Kong. He has Uyghurs who are angry with him. And I don't see him pushing this issue. And if he does, he has the concern that it's going to backfire. So I don't see this being a neat juxtaposition the way the polls you cited indicate, as here we have a group of people in Taiwan thinking one thing, and here we have a group of people in China thinking another.
Richard, can I comment on this?
Yeah, please.
I think that, as Jacques said, the 90% support for the status quo is not surprising. And I think it's going to continue, basically, to be that. And, of course, there are differentiations within the status quo about what you want to do at the end of the day. But mainly, it's not an ardently Taiwan independence group, and it certainly is not an ardently unification group. I think that public opinion in the mainland could make a huge difference if we were talking about a real threat to Taiwan independence, and the leadership in Beijing was not doing something to stop it. That's one thing. It's sort of not quite the same, but who lost China, who lost Taiwan kind of syndrome. That's not what's going on. And so I think that the leadership in Beijing certainly can deal with this situation. The question is, as I tried to indicate before, whether they're only going to deal with a short-term problem of trying to force some kind of a mantra on Tsai, or whether they're going to think about the long term. And I think this whole issue basically is a long-term issue. I mean really long-term. And so the question about what the relationship will be eventually, it's only going to be resolved peacefully if essentially it's acceptable to both sides. And that's going to take a long time.
I would only add that opinions are opinions, and they can be based on facts and objective knowledge, or they can be based on impressions formed from wherever. I don't have the impression that people in China have an objective understanding of Taiwan. If they did, I might take it more seriously, but they don't. And we know why that's the case, right? We know why they don't know. Thanks. Next, Joe Bosco, I promised you, and then Beverly.
Thank you. Joe Bosco, formerly with the Defense Department. I think Jacques' last point was that much will depend on how China reacts to the evolving situation in Taiwan.
Hold the mic closer.
And how the U.S. reacts to China's reaction.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I've heard a reference to the anti-secession law of 2005, in which China stated that not only would moves toward independence justify the use of force or non-peaceful means, but that even a failure to come to grips with unification by peaceful means, if all means were exhausted. China also stated that it had a rationale for the use of non-peaceful means. So what's your thought on how patient China will be under now a Tsai administration in terms of not moving toward unification, not simply not declaring independence?
Sounds like a question for our lawyer.
Well, I mean, the legal part, that's easy. The political part is hard. Yeah. I mean, in many ways, the genius of the anti-secession law was it was a backhanded homage to the Taiwan Relations Act, right? I mean, where we did as a matter of domestic law something that re-upped Taiwan to the kind of international state-to-state-like relationship, the government-to-government relationship that it used to have, and then many years later, China gets around to saying, well, we're going to pass this law about something which is functionally out there in the international community and treated like a domestic issue. So it wound up being politically provocative, but in a way it was legally quite conservative, and I think in a longer-term political way quite conservative. That is, by saying there is not a reunification agenda, there's an anti-secession agenda, then you basically didn't have to have a timetable for action. Yes, it was built into the 2000 white paper. Yes, there are traces of it in the anti-secession law, but the real thrust of that, it seems to me, was we are saying don't secede, you haven't seceded, and so as long as the status quo is here, we can live with it for some indefinite period of time. What's an indefinite period of time? I mean, that's going to be the big question going forward. I think we are in a position now where Beijing has, for the foreseeable future, won the anti-independence issue and lost the reunification issue. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how long can it live with that structure? I hope and on balance think that we'll see patience amid the short-term chill, and that as long as Tsai sticks with what she said, which is not everything Beijing wants, but is not a repudiation in a fundamental way of the status quo for the last 8 years, that there will be a willingness to live with that for some period of time, and that in a way there's actually probably a ratcheting down of the pressure, because I think in the Ma years there was a sense of, the shark is moving, keep it moving forward or it drowns, and then toward the end an attempt to get some things in before Ma left, and I think now there's a realization that it would be futile to push that, and if they push it, they paint themselves into a nasty corner. So I'm hoping that's the way it works, although I wouldn't bet the farm on it.
I would agree with that. I would say, though, that the distinction between the white paper and the anti-secession law, one big distinction, is that the white paper talked about, I think it was the 2001, if you don't actually negotiate unification within a period of time,
Indefinite delay was
indefinite period of time, then the use of force would be envisaged. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. The anti-secession law looks at that quite differently. It takes out this time factor, and I think you get into exactly the situation that Jacques has described. So I agree totally that there's no reason for Beijing to lose patience as long as we're not seeing Taiwan move in a Taiwan independence direction. I think it would be fundamentally against PRC interests, so that also enters into my judgment about what they will and won't do. Why get into a confrontation potentially, among other things, with the United States when you really don't need that?
Well, but then you come back to the point I was trying to make, and that is, as long as they can keep hope alive that they will get clones of Ma Ying-jeou in the future, they can extend that time frame. But if you come to the conclusion, based on objective reality, that Ma Ying-jeou was the last of his breed, then you might have to reassess.
Maybe,
But they may not want to see that there will be no more clones.
I understand.
Yeah.
I also think that, and this is something you and I have discussed a lot, they need to rethink some of the basic principles, right? Definitions of one China, unification, even sovereignty, before you can get to the possibility of really speaking seriously about a solution that will be acceptable on both sides. So even without a Ma Ying-jeou, it seems to me I wouldn't rule out the possibility they can find a way forward, but it's going to take a very long time and a lot of rethinking.
Beverly?
Hi, Beverly Hong Fincher, retired professor. Do not belong to anybody. Okay, Vincent
Keep the mic
mentioned
close.
the word
Keep the mic
mentioned the word discourse, the Taiwan discourse, the mainland discourse, ROC discourse, and nobody mentioned that discourse of youth. I had the opportunity to go to Cambridge, Mass, and it was at that time I was coming up the subway in Cambridge, and they were demonstrating. The Taiyanghua was demonstrating in front of that. And I didn't understand. Being a linguist, I was ashamed that I did not understand what they were, these new compounds, Fu Mao, etc. And I asked one of them, carrying a Taiyanghua, and I asked them, I said, what does Fu Mao mean? And she said, don't you know about it? 你怎么会不知道? Okay. And then I said, 我真的不知道，你能不能告诉我，你是在这儿抗议的人？ And then she said, 那你就去 Google 嘛。Okay, two answers.
Translate the last.
Two answers.
Yep, translate the last sentence.
Okay, so please Google. Google it.
Why don't you find the answer on Google?
So she did not answer neither question. So I think I would worry about Tsai Ing-wen having to educate the new youth. I think we all should be concerned about educating the youth, and that's the discourse of the youth that I'm concerned about. So I don't know if Vincent has any answer.
I'll get a start. Maybe Shirley or somebody else could continue. During the presidential campaign leading to 2016, there was a discussion about so-called 天然独, right, natural independence. So the impression was that this younger generation of Taiwanese, the millennials and so on, they were naturally identified with Taiwan, and to them, Taiwan is all their existence and so on. And of course, they also played an important role in the Sunflower movement. I don't know if my observation is that Tsai's electoral victory actually benefited from the sunflower movement rather than the other way around, and that she doesn't need to educate them very much because they are already naturally independent. This is just a first cut. You know.
I think older generations in Taiwan need to do a better job of talking to younger generations. It's not just Tsai Ing-wen who's going to have a problem.
Come on, Richard, you've got kids. You know what that's like.
Well, and Beijing is very worried about this.
I think we're going to have to cut it short because we've gone over, and I imagine somebody else will need the room. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank panelists. Starting on my thank you. Thank the panelists for this session, and particularly want to thank FPRI and the opportunity to collaborate with you. I want to thank Jacques for his leadership. I want to thank Eli Gilman of FPRI and my colleague Maeve Whelan-Wiest, who really did all the work. I think we've put a lot on the table. This story is not going to go away, so I think we'll be back fairly soon to talk about it again. So thank you very much.